we would have free power for everything. So how much would your life cost if you had free power, all industry had free power, and your delivery really cost no motor fuels on the input, and everything was completely free down the way except the labor of the people, literally?
There's a book series called Beggars in Spain that talk a little bit about the, society's shift from dependence on fossil fuels to free energy. And
the Biden administration and Democrats in Congress are wasting no time in their efforts to reset the direction of America's future. The Wall Street Journal estimates that of the $1.7 trillion stimulus bill, only $825 billion was directly related to COVID. And it's estimated that 2021 will include another $3 trillion in stimulus money printing, bringing the total to $6.3 trillion in 2020 and 2021 alone. And that's why you'll instantly understand when Wells Fargo and Goldman Sachs both say it's the time to buy gold. It's time to heed that advice. Patriot Gold Group has the No Fee for Life IRA, where your IRA or 401k can be in physical gold and silver, and you may be eligible for the No Fee for Life IRA. So go ahead and give the folks at Patriot Gold Group a call to discuss physical gold and silver. And the knowledge that Patriot Gold Group is Consumer Affairs' top-rated gold IRA dealer 5 years in a row from 2016 until present. Click the link in the description box below for more information. And now on with the video.
When you mix space science and spiritual beliefs, they all seem to come together, in the end. And I don't know how we got this direction, David. Honestly, I think it's Alan's fault. He pointed to the question.
I tend to start off on the surface of the planet here and then end up somewhere out on Neptune or somewhere watching the weather up there. So, yeah, I can twist off in many different directions.
No, that makes sense, the mixing. Because imagine if you, let's take a step back 2,000 years ago or 3,500, or we can go back any amount of time. A lot of these ancient cultures knew this mechanism in the interaction of electromagnetic fields. I'm sure they could see it. Because after one of these events, I'm also making another bold call. We're going to start to see ley lines in areas that have still the mineral composition in the crust start to glow around 2024 from the electromagnetic effects. Because a lot of these things, the electric's going to run down the lines, whether it's a copper line coming down to feed your house, or whether it's a iron ore vein in the surface of the earth, or a silver vein running across the side of a mountain. That stuff's going to start to glow again.
You mentioned Brooklyn currents, and I was thinking what's called the Northern Lights, the Aurora Borealis and such. That's basically kind of a Brooklyn current type event, is it not?
Yeah, those are called field-aligned currents, and yes, they're using the exact same principle. Now, you can't see those field lines up there, can you? I mean, you can when those auroras are running down the lines and make it visible. Now, these plasma ropes that have also been started to be seen. Here's a funny one. Steve is the name. No, I'm saying the name of they were camping out one night, and I guess they were having a bunch of beers in Canada, and they saw an auroral rope form, and it hadn't been named before because of a brand new phenomenon, about 2017. So whoever discovers it gets to name it, and they were around the campfire, and they go, "We'll call it Steve." No kidding. I kid you not.
Oh, that's great.
Steve's been cited many more times. Like they'd never seen it before ever. It was a brand new thing, and they named it Steve. And now it's turned up 100 times in the last 3 or 4 years, from being not visible before and never seen to being seen 100 times or plus in the last 4 years. So what's going on with that from 0 to 100 literally in 4 years? But those field-aligned currents are always in there. It's always in space. That's what toroid looping magnetic wave is following that back in on both of our poles. So when the plasma starts glowing, it follows that because it's on that line, literally on the line that's invisible in space, until it gets enough electric charge into it to let your eyes see it, and it pops on and turns glow mode. It gets more active. So if you look at that and think about those plasma ropes up there, that's kind of the center of the squatter man. So, you ask your question, like, how much more charged does the atmosphere have to become before it gets the arms and the head? And we're looking at canyon wall petroglyphs in real life in front of us, because so far we got at least one anatomical part of that squatter man already arrived in our skies. The reason I said that is following what you're talking about. It's following those field line currents down onto the poles. Look at Steve, the plasma rope, you'll see what I mean. It's a beautiful configuration in the sky. And you can actually see how it turns in on itself. Those two ropes that are overlapping, that's the Brooklyn current. You see that intertwining of the current there. It's not just a single line. It's two lines running in parallel, twined together.
Right, and to even try to begin to understand a lot of this stuff out there, folks, you have to kind of look into some of the physics that we have not really been informed that much about. Plasma physics, torsion physics, spin polarizations, and the effects that they can have. Spin an electron in everything one direction, and it will create effects. You spin it the other direction, and you kind of like what happens in a Tesla coil. You wrap your coil the wrong direction, your Tesla coil doesn't work. They say, gee, we don't know why that happens. But this is more basically what they call the occulted knowledge we're getting into, correct?
Yes, but once you understand the flow of these different mechanisms, for me it means free power generation, electromagnetism, and weightless transportation, which means the entire dynamics of how our economy has been set up for the last 200 years shatters in a fifth of a second when you're provided with free power, and we can make objects weightless or near weightless and get them to go down a system of things that we don't need anymore. But we're still locked in the oil when we could all have free electricity with, let's say, Preparedness magnetic motors. The thoughts are endless on how we could utilize this free power system instead of enslaving ourselves and going to work on jobs that you hate so you can pay for stuff just to keep your house with your gas, with your cars, with the electricity and this and that, and all these systems that require all this power to generate and make the stuff that we use. We could stop all of that. We would have free power for everything. So how much would your life cost if you had free power, all industry had free power, and your delivery really cost no motor fuels on the input, and everything was completely free down the way except the labor of the people, literally?
There's a book series called Beggars in Spain that talk a little bit about the, society's shift from dependence on fossil fuels to free energy. Now, when you say this word, I'm unfamiliar with it, Preparedness electric motors, is that kind of like where you harness the power of, well, for the lack of my terms, harness the ether?
I want to take you back to your school days when we were all school kids. Did you ever have two magnets and you put them on a table?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And sometimes you try to push them together and they would push themselves apart because there's a magnetic field around each one, and the same, whatever orientation you do, they'll just snap together instantly or they'll push each other apart indefinitely. Well, what you want to do is you want to harness the pushing apart, and you're simply using magnets like you were a kid in kindergarten to drive two discs to go in the opposite direction so it spins, and then you connect that. You could do a real simple one and connect it to an alternator from a car as long as it's spinning. So you're not using the fossil fuels to get the engine to spin. You're using magnets pushing off of each other to make something else spin. And that still drives a shaft, and that shaft can be connected anything with power. And it's the simplest of the basic technologies where you're using magnets to push off of each other.
This goes back to that October thing, 2024, right? Where we have a big change in our solar system. Or did I get the date wrong there?
No, October of 2024, that's right. Now, I am not in any belief that our poles are going to go into a full flip. We have massive magnetic wander right now, which makes sense. If you're going to add in another electromagnetic field, the primary field is going to, it's going to behave. It's going to reorient a little bit, and it's bouncing all over the place. There's going to be a lot more animal strandings, whale strandings, and dolphins and these kind of things that locate with magnetic fields. There's going to be a real twist. It should increase also the amount of strandings and weirdness of birds in the wrong places or things migrating to the wrong place during this time when we're getting this second electromagnetic field. But I do not think that it's going to do a full flip. I think it's going to continue wandering around. And as we pass through 2024 or whatever, it'll start to restabilize again, and it'll get tweaky and weird, but I personally don't feel it's going to go to full flip. If it goes to full flip, nothing on the planet will work anymore, because you mentioned it. You know how if you spin or you wire the Tesla coil incorrectly, it won't fire off? Well, that would happen with every single motor on our planet, because the way it's oriented right now, the way magnetic fields are oriented, the reason your motor runs is because it's at a certain magnetic orientation. If that reverses, nothing will work on the planet.
You were just kind of explaining, the basic principles of, say, like an electric motor is we, it's a bipolar system. You use a north and a south pole, flipping the magnetic fields to create the propulsion that spins the rotor. But then you have things like, John Bedini played with, unipolar motors, which, uses only one side of a magnet, but it's all in the arrangement, once again, of, a bifilar wound coil running through, a particular, circuit set up a certain way. And, you got a little motor there that'll spin 10,000 RPM, and it doesn't work like, the little motors you could build with a nail, and a battery and stuff like that, and a couple of magnets. A lot of things that we haven't been told about. And with the pole flip thing, I've heard postulations show that when the pole does flip, north goes to south, south goes to north. Well, does the Earth actually start spinning the other direction? And could this be a possibility of the stories of the mass floods, where the whole Earth is just inundated? Because if you have a ball that's swirling out there and you have all this water floating around with it, and all of a sudden it kind of stops and flips the other direction, well, there's going to be a tidal surge that just pretty much is going to be devastating. There's so many possibilities.
Hypothetically, if the Earth stopped, and it did stop, it would stop for however long it did. But since the Earth's not exactly round, and on the equatorial we get the bulge because of the centrifugal forces, if it stopped completely, land would literally sink under the ocean. You wouldn't even need the tidal wave. It would just sink, because everything would reorient on the crust. And then once it started spinning again, new lands would pop out of the ocean, and then there would be something that was above land that would now be 6,000 feet under the water instantly with no tidal wave required. Because you got to think I think it's 21 miles difference at the crust than it is to the pole, just because of the way the Earth's spinning. That equatorial, they call it the equatorial bulge because it is such a thing. So imagine if the Earth stopped, okay, and if its magnetic field was affected that much and it stopped, that means it could tilt a little bit. It's not going to go full flip, but, it could move a couple hundred miles in any direction. It could shift a little bit, a couple hundred, but once it started spinning again, oops, there's going to, imagine moving 200 miles off the equator in any direction and tilting the planet a little bit and then spinning it. There would be a lot of new land and a lot of old land that would go underwater, and a lot of new land popping up. But the reason I said that is that it brought me that thought is, let's go with the light version of what I think is going to happen in 2024. I think personally, this makes a lot of sense if people follow mud flood and Tartaria and this type of thing. I know there's a whole crew of people out there trying to do mud flood research. And for me, that's kind of a trigger word, just like UFO or Bigfoot. There's these words that have been put out there. So when you want to start the conversation about a real topic that has real dire effects for our society, it's turned into that laughing, like, oh, you said chemtrails, I'm not going to talk to that. That's a conspiracy. Right. But if you call it, atmospheric aerial dispersal or something, it has a whole different range on it, to start the conversation. Well, you could say mud flood, but a lot of people go, oh, that's a conspiracy. So if you call it a global liquefaction event, it brings a whole scientific discussion to bear at the same time. Same event, same everything, just a different way to label it. It's called a global liquefaction event, otherwise known as a mud flood. So during this time, the top 1 to 2 miles of our crust is going to be heavily affected. And I'll just say even the top 1 mile of the crust during this second magnetic field edition 2024. So what that means for you and me is there's going to be an enormous amount of more mud volcanoes, sand volcanoes, earth cracks, and sinkholes that you're going to see. Now, what we're seeing with the uptick in volcanic activity and the earthquakes, that's a given. Okay, we know that's going to happen, so we'll just slide that over. That's too easy picking. That's way too low fruit. That's on the ground. I want to get something that has some relevance that'll show you, because anybody could say, well, there'll be an uptick in volcanoes. Well, that's too easy to call. I'm going to say absolutely. You're looking for an uptick in mud related events, mud volcanoes, geysers going off. So far beyond that, it would make news on either how many eruptions or the size of the geyser eruptions. Sand volcanoes that will come out of nowhere. Sand volcanoes are very rare. So if you start to see a sand volcano go off, this is part of it, because we're only talking about the top 1 mile or so of the crust, not the entire depth. 1.5 maximum. I couldn't see it going any more than 2 miles. But all these events are going to start happening on the very, very surface. Cracks in the earth. Rivers and ponds might drain if there's a crack, and then there's a way for that water to seep down in. So these are the things that you're going to look for to verify that that second magnetic field's coming in. Think about this. If we come into this event and there's more water in the Earth's crust than there is on all the oceans above the crust. So if we come into this time in 2024 and we start to get an enormous amount of mud oozing out of the planet in different areas, it would explain why there's a lot of buildings through history that are half buried, or they cracked walls and doors into the second floors of buildings because they couldn't unbury what had been completely filled with earth. You know, they didn't have quote unquote steam shovels way back. Well, they did back in the early 1900s finally, but this last time this event apparently occurred right at the Dalton minimum in the 1800s. And then you go back again and you get an enormous amount of paintings and different kind of lithographs, etc., in the 1600s that show there was a massive amount of some kind of earth mud flowing everywhere, burying castles, cities. They had to literally start over, where you'll just get the spire of a castle sticking out over the landslides, what you want to call them today. But if you start seeing rivers of mud flowing out of the sides of mountains, and this is the kind of thing you're going to look for, because that's really hard to call. And if it happens, then the mechanisms can be explained for all of you out there following mud flood. The mechanism could be explained through science, why that mud emanates and buries buildings and cities on a regular cyclical pattern that can't be explained, and why there's so many, when you excavate a lot of the older parts of towns and cities, that they're finding buried everything, this, there, and everywhere. It explains it through science. This is what's coming in 2024 again. So imagine when our bridges and roads get covered, how difficult is it going to be to get our transportation systems up and running? See, I think the reason that everything's pushing to rail right now is it'll be easier to repair rail tracks than it will to repair a bridge. But you could still run an enormous amount of cargo down rail tracks and then step back in the late 1800s, early 1900s and see where the rail terminus were back in 100 years ago when the thriving rural communities, because that's where the trains will stop. And there's going to be a resurgence across so many parts of many countries of the world.
Hold on and breathe, folks.